Hey guys, tonight we're talking about Clenbuterol, a drug that solved one problem and created 100 others. Doctors designed it to help asthma patients breathe easier. Athletes turned it into a weapon that made their hearts beat so fast some of them never slowed down again. The pharmaceutical company wanted to relax bronchial tubes. Bodybuilders wanted visible abs, and they got them along with trembling hands, sleepless nights, and cardiac arrhythmias that felt like dying but technically weren't. Here's the beautiful irony. A medication meant to open your airways became famous for opening the door to every competitive advantage imaginable, legal consequences included. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand Clenbuterol, you first need to understand that pharmaceutical breakthroughs rarely stay within their intended boundaries. Boehringer Ingelheim, a German pharmaceutical company with a respectable history dating back to 1885, synthesized Clenbuterol in 1977. Their chemists weren't trying to revolutionize athletics. They wanted a better bronchodilator for patients suffering from asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Previous medications worked but came with problematic side effects that limited their usefulness. The research team focused on creating a selective beta-2 adrenergic agonist, which in plain language means a chemical that targets specific receptors in your lungs without affecting your entire cardiovascular system. They succeeded technically. The drug performed exactly as designed in clinical trials throughout the late 1970s. European doctors started prescribing Clenbuterol under brand names like Spiropent and Ventipulmin by 1980. Patients with breathing difficulties found relief within minutes of taking it. The compound worked by binding to beta-2 receptors in bronchial smooth muscle tissue, triggering a cascade of cellular events that relaxed constricted airways. Imagine your lungs as a restaurant kitchen during dinner rush, and suddenly, someone opens all the windows. That's Clenbuterol doing its job. Medical literature praised its efficacy and duration of action, noting that a single dose provided relief for up to 34 hours, compared to older drugs that lasted maybe 6. Respiratory specialists particularly appreciated that it didn't significantly raise blood pressure or cause cardiac stimulation at therapeutic doses. The mechanism seemed almost elegant in its simplicity. Your body contains different types of adrenergic receptors, each responding to adrenaline and similar compounds. Beta-2 receptors exist primarily in your lungs, but also scatter throughout other tissues including skeletal muscle and fat cells. Clenbuterol acts like a key that fits specifically into beta-2 locks, turning them all at once. In the lungs, this relaxation saves lives. Elsewhere in the body, those same receptors control entirely different processes. Fat cells, when stimulated, start breaking down stored triglycerides for energy. Muscle cells shift their metabolism toward preservation rather than breakdown during caloric deficits. The drug essentially tells your body to burn everything available for fuel while protecting the machinery that produces strength. Therapeutic doses for asthma range from 20 to 40 micrograms daily, split into 2 administrations. At this level, patients breathed easier without major complications. Side effects existed but remained manageable. Occasional hand tremors, mild headaches, slight elevation in heart rate. Nothing that outweighed the benefit of actually being able to breathe properly. The medical establishment considered Clenbuterol a success story, another incremental improvement in treating chronic respiratory conditions. Pulmonologists published positive case studies. Insurance companies approved coverage. Pharmacies stocked it alongside other respiratory medications. Everything suggested this would remain a niche pharmaceutical product for a specific patient population. Then someone noticed their body composition changing. Patients using Clenbuterol for legitimate medical reasons started reporting unexpected weight loss, despite eating normally. Some mention increased muscle definition without changing exercise routines. Doctors initially dismissed these observations as coincidental or attributed them to patients feeling better and becoming more active. The scientific literature didn't emphasize these effects because researchers were focused on respiratory outcomes. Clinical trials measured lung function, not body fat percentage. But the anecdotal reports kept coming, and eventually someone connected the dots between beta-2 receptor stimulation and metabolic rate. The drug doesn't just relax bronchial tubes, it cranks your entire metabolism into overdrive through a process called thermogenesis. Think of your cells as tiny engines that normally idle at a comfortable temperature. Clenbuterol removes the governor and slams the accelerator down. Your core body temperature rises slightly, usually between 0.5 degree and a full degree Celsius. That doesn't sound dramatic until you realize your body must burn significantly more calories to maintain that elevated temperature around the clock. The effect compounds over weeks of continuous use. Someone taking Clenbuterol while maintaining their normal diet could lose substantial body fat without changing anything else. Add a caloric deficit and exercise program, and the results became almost obscene. Athletes paid attention. By the early 1980s, whispers circulated through European athletic communities about asthma medication that melted fat and preserved muscle simultaneously. East German sports scientists, already notorious for their pharmaceutical programs, began investigating Clenbuterol's performance enhancement potential. Their state-sponsored doping operation had perfected the art of finding legitimate medications and repurposing them for competitive advantage. Clenbuterol fit their needs perfectly because it wasn't technically an anabolic steroid, which meant existing anti-doping tests couldn't detect it. The drug occupied a legal grey zone where regulations hadn't caught up to reality. The doses athletes experimented with bore no resemblance to medical recommendations. While asthma patients took 20 to 40 micrograms daily, bodybuilders and track athletes started with 80 micrograms and worked up to 120 or even 160 micrograms. At these levels, the side effects became impossible to ignore. Hands shook constantly, making fine motor tasks difficult. Sleep became nearly impossible as the drug kept the nervous system perpetually activated. Heart palpitations occurred randomly throughout the day, sometimes severe enough to cause panic. Muscle cramps struck without warning as electrolyte balances shifted. None of this deterred use because the physical results were undeniable. Cycling teams showed particular interest. Road racing demands an optimal power-to-weight ratio, and Clenbuterol delivered exactly that by reducing body fat, while maintaining the leg muscles that generate wattage. Rumours spread about entire squads using it during training camps. Track and field athletes found it valuable during cutting phases before major competitions. Boxers and wrestlers used it to make weight while preserving strength. The underground network expanded quietly, passing information gym to gym, athlete to athlete, coach to coach. No advertising was necessary because results spoke for themselves. The pharmaceutical company remained blissfully unaware that their respiratory medication had become an underground performance enhancer. Boehringer Ingelheim continued marketing Clenbuterol for asthma and COPD throughout the 1980s, publishing medical research and expanding into additional European markets. Their sales representatives visited doctors' offices to discuss proper dosing protocols for breathing disorders. Meanwhile, veterinarians discovered another application entirely. Livestock farmers found that Clenbuterol increased lean muscle mass in cattle while reducing fat deposition. The agricultural industry embraced this effect enthusiastically, creating yet another supply chain that would eventually feed the black market. By 1985, Clenbuterol existed in 3 parallel universes. In one universe, it remained a legitimate pharmaceutical product helping respiratory patients live normal lives. In another, it had become a veterinary growth promoter, creating leaner livestock. In the third, it was transforming into sport's worst-kept secret, the substance everyone used and nobody admitted to using. These three worlds would eventually collide in spectacular fashion, but for now they operated independently, each unaware of how the others would complicate everything. The drug that German chemists created to open airways had instead opened Pandora's box, and nobody had any idea how to close it again. Understanding what clenbuterol does to a human body requires abandoning comfortable medical terminology and confronting biological reality. The drug doesn't gently suggest changes, it hijacks your autonomic nervous system and forces every cell into crisis mode permanently. Your body interprets clenbuterol as an emergency signal, the chemical equivalent of someone screaming that a predator is chasing you. Except the chase never ends. The predator never catches you, and you never get to rest. This state of perpetual emergency becomes the new normal within hours of the first dose. Beta-2 adrenergic receptors exist throughout your body like tiny switches waiting for the right chemical signal. Under normal circumstances, your body produces adrenaline and noradrenaline during moments of stress or physical exertion. These hormones bind to various receptor types, triggering appropriate responses. Beta-1 receptors in your heart speed up the pulse. Alpha receptors constrict blood vessels. Beta-2 receptors relax smooth muscle tissue in your lungs and activate certain metabolic pathways in fat and muscle cells. Evolution designed this system for temporary activation during genuine emergencies, not continuous stimulation for weeks. Clenbuterol binds to beta-2 receptors with exceptional selectivity and refuses to let go for hours. A single dose activates these receptors far more intensely than natural adrenaline ever could. The molecular structure of clenbuterol includes modifications that make it resist breakdown by enzymes that normally deactivate adrenaline within minutes. This extended activity period explains why asthma patients needed only 2 doses daily, but also why athletes ended up trapped in a stimulated state they couldn't escape. Taking clenbuterol at 8 a.m. meant those receptors stayed activated past midnight, keeping every affected system running hot for 16 hours straight. The metabolic cascade begins in fat cells. Adipocytes store energy as triglycerides, waiting for signals that the body needs fuel. Clenbuterol provides that signal with nuclear intensity. The activated beta-2 receptors trigger an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, which starts dismantling stored fat at an accelerated rate. Free fatty acids flood into the bloodstream, heading toward muscle tissue and other organs for combustion. Under normal conditions, fat breakdown follows a careful rhythm matching energy expenditure. Clenbuterol throws that rhythm into chaos. Fat cells dump their contents whether the body needs immediate energy or not, forcing the system to burn everything available. Simultaneously, the drug alters cellular respiration in ways that generate excess heat. Your mitochondria, the power plants inside each cell, normally operate at maybe 40% efficiency converting food into usable energy. The remaining 60% dissipates as heat, which is why your body maintains a temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. Clenbuterol makes this process even less efficient, increasing the heat waste to perhaps 70%. Every cellular process generates more thermal energy than necessary. This thermogenic effect sounds minor until calculations reveal the actual caloric cost. Maintaining an elevated body temperature for weeks burns an additional 200 to 500 calories daily without any physical activity whatsoever. Muscle tissue responds differently than fat. Skeletal muscles contain beta-2 receptors that, when activated, shift protein metabolism toward preservation rather than breakdown. During caloric restriction, the body normally cannibalizes muscle along with fat to meet energy needs. Clenbuterol disrupts this process by upregulating genes involved in muscle protein synthesis, while simultaneously downregulating genes responsible for protein degradation. The drug essentially instructs muscles to hold their structure even when the body desperately needs calories. This anti-catabolic effect made clenbuterol invaluable to bodybuilders preparing for competitions, where the goal involves maximum muscle retention while eliminating every ounce of subcutaneous fat. The oxygen transport advantage emerged as an unexpected bonus. Increased beta-2 receptor stimulation dilates blood vessels in skeletal muscle, improving nutrient and oxygen delivery during exercise. Athletes reported better endurance and delayed fatigue, particularly during aerobic activities. Cyclists noticed they could maintain higher power outputs for longer durations. Runners found their lactate threshold shifted upward. These performance benefits existed independently from the fat loss effects, creating multiple reasons to use the drug beyond simple aesthetics. Every competitive advantage compounded with the others, making clenbuterol a multi-tool solution for various athletic challenges. Then the complications started appearing. Hand tremors manifested first, usually within the initial 48 hours of use. The excessive beta-2 stimulation affected fine motor control in ways that couldn't be hidden. Users found themselves unable to hold a coffee cup steady or write legibly. The tremors worsened with higher doses, sometimes becoming violent enough to interfere with daily activities. Athletes in sports requiring precision like shooting or archery discovered clenbuterol made competition impossible. Even bodybuilders, who primarily needed to look good standing still, struggled with basic tasks like buttoning shirts or typing on keyboards. Sleep disturbances followed inevitably. Clenbuterol keeps the nervous system activated in ways that prevent the natural wind-down process necessary for sleep onset. Users lay in bed feeling physically exhausted but mentally wired, heart racing, thoughts spinning. The drug's long half-life meant taking it too late in the day guaranteed insomnia, but even morning doses sometimes prevented sleep 12 hours later. Chronic sleep deprivation compounded every other side effect, creating a deteriorating cycle. Exhausted users made poor decisions about dosing, sometimes increasing amounts hoping to power through the fatigue, which only worsened the sleep problems. Cardiac effects range from annoying to life-threatening. Elevated resting heart rate became standard, with users reporting pulses between 90 and 110 beats per minute, even while sitting calmly. Palpitations struck randomly, sometimes mild flutters that pass quickly, other times sustained arrhythmias lasting minutes. The sensation of one's heart beating irregularly triggers primal fear in ways few other experiences can match. Some users ended up in emergency rooms convinced they were having heart attacks, only to test negative for cardiac damage while still experiencing terrifying rhythm disturbances. Doctors unfamiliar with clenbuterol abuse struggled to explain symptoms that made no sense for the patient's age and health status. Electrolyte depletion caused problems that escalated dangerously. Clenbuterol increases potassium movement into cells, dropping serum potassium levels below normal ranges. Hypokalemia manifests as muscle weakness, cramping, and in severe cases dangerous cardiac arrhythmias. The drug also affects magnesium and taurine levels, creating a perfect storm of mineral imbalances. Athletes accustomed to taking supplements often underestimated how much additional supplementation clenbuterol required. Severe cramping could strike during training sessions, rendering muscles temporarily useless. Worse, depleted electrolytes made existing heart rhythm problems potentially fatal instead of merely uncomfortable. The dosing comparison reveals the magnitude of abuse. Legitimate asthma patients took 20 to 40 micrograms split across 2 doses daily. This level provided symptom relief with minimal side effects. Competitive bodybuilders started at 40 to 60 micrograms daily, and ramped up over 2 weeks to 120 or 140 micrograms. Some pushed to 160 micrograms or beyond, chasing increasingly marginal returns while multiplying risks exponentially. At these doses, every side effect intensified. Tremors became debilitating, sleep became impossible, hearts raced constantly. The body existed in a state of pharmaceutical emergency that no evolutionary adaptation prepared it to handle. Users developed elaborate protocols attempting to manage the chaos. The most common approach involved 2 weeks on clenbuterol followed by 2 weeks off. This cycling prevented beta-2 receptor downregulation, a process where prolonged stimulation causes cells to reduce receptor density to protect themselves from excessive activation. Without breaks, the drug gradually stopped working as effectively, forcing users to increase doses further into dangerous territory. The 2-week cycles allowed receptors to regenerate, maintaining sensitivity to the drug. Some users supplemented with ketotifen, an antihistamine that supposedly prevented receptor downregulation, allowing continuous use. The complexity of these protocols demonstrated that users understood they were playing with fire, but chose to proceed anyway. The holy grail of body composition had been discovered, and it was toxic. Every previous fat loss method involved some compromise. Caloric restriction worked but caused muscle loss. Excessive cardio burned fat but also burned muscle and crushed metabolism. Stimulants like caffeine and ephedrine provided energy, but offered minimal direct fat burning. Anabolic steroids built muscle, but didn't efficiently burn fat and came with their own severe complications. Clenbuterol stood alone as the substance that attacked fat stores relentlessly, while actively protecting muscle tissue, all while boosting energy and workout capacity. The combination proved irresistible despite mounting evidence of cardiac damage, electrolyte disasters, and psychological effects from chronic sleep deprivation. Pharmaceutical companies certainly never intended these applications when synthesizing beta-2 agonists for respiratory therapy. The therapeutic window between effective dose and dangerous dose was supposed to be wide enough to prevent serious complications in patients using the drug as prescribed. That safety margin assumed rational dosing under medical supervision. Athletes obliterated those assumptions by taking quadruple the maximum medical dose, and doing so without any monitoring or adjustment for individual response. The drug that opened airways with elegant precision became a sledgehammer smashing through metabolic regulation, and the people swinging that sledgehammer convinced themselves the damage was worth it for abs visible from across a room. East Germany's sports machine didn't stumble upon Clenbuterol by accident. The Deutsche Hochschule für Körperkultur in Leipzig employed scientists whose sole purpose involved finding pharmaceutical advantages that existing doping tests couldn't detect. State Directive 14.25, a classified document from 1974, explicitly ordered researchers to identify performance-enhancing substances not detectable by current Western methodologies. Clenbuterol arrived on their radar around 1982, shortly after veterinary applications began appearing in Western European agriculture. The drug's legal status as a bronchodilator meant athletes could theoretically possess it for legitimate medical reasons, providing plausible deniability if questions ever arose. Testing protocols in the 1980s focused almost exclusively on anabolic steroids and testosterone. Anti-doping laboratories lacked reference standards for beta-2 agonists because nobody considered asthma medications performance enhancers worth pursuing. East German researchers exploited this gap mercilessly. Swimmers, track athletes, and cyclists received clenbuterol alongside their regular steroid regimens during training camps at facilities like Kienbaum and Kreischer. Coaches distributed the drug under code names in unmarked containers. Athletes sometimes didn't know what they were taking, only that refusing meant exclusion from elite programs and loss of state financial support. The results spoke through medal counts. East German track and field athletes dominated European championships throughout the mid-1980s, despite representing a nation of only 16 million people. Female swimmers developed physiques that Western coaches found physiologically improbable. Shot putters and discus throwers displayed lean muscle mass that shouldn't have existed at their weight classes. Western sports scientists suspected steroid use, which was partially correct, but missed the secondary layer of pharmaceutical enhancement. Clenbuterol's fat-reducing effects created the aesthetic illusion of natural athleticism, even when bodies were chemically constructed from multiple drug classes working in concert. Spanish cycling teams adopted clenbuterol by 1988, though evidence suggests earlier experimentation. The Tour de France and Vuelta a España rewarded riders who could generate maximum power at minimum body weight. Professional cyclists already operated at body fat percentages around 6 to 8% through brutal training and dietary restriction. Clenbuterol allowed them to push below 5% while maintaining the leg strength necessary to climb mountain stages. Team doctors prescribed the drug openly in some cases, hiding behind its legitimate pharmaceutical status. Spain's regulatory environment allowed clenbuterol possession with proper documentation, creating legal cover for what was clearly performance enhancement rather than asthma treatment. The Kelmer cycling team faced particular scrutiny during the 1991 season. Multiple riders tested positive for excessive levels of salbutamol, a different beta-2 agonist, during stage races. Investigators suspected clenbuterol use but couldn't prove it because testing methodologies remained underdeveloped. The riders claimed legitimate asthma requiring treatment, despite none having documented respiratory problems before turning professional. This became the standard defense: develop convenient asthma diagnoses that justified carrying inhalers and tablets to every competition. Medical exemptions transformed banned substances into permitted medications through paperwork rather than genuine medical need. Soviet and Russian weightlifters integrated clenbuterol into preparation cycles for major competitions. The collapse of the USSR in 1991 didn't dismantle the sports infrastructure that had produced Olympic champions for decades. Coaches trained under the old system continued operating with the same pharmaceutical playbooks. Weightlifters needed explosive power, but competed in specific weight classes, making clenbuterol's muscle-sparing fat loss ideal for making weight without sacrificing strength. Training facilities in Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev became unofficial laboratories where athletes experimented with drug combinations that would horrify medical professionals. Clenbuterol stacked with anabolic steroids, thyroid hormones, and stimulants created synergistic effects that exceeded the sum of individual substances. British track athletes quietly joined the clenbuterol adoption wave by the early 1990s. Linford Christie's remarkable physique at age 32, when he won Olympic gold in the 100 metres at Barcelona, raised questions that never quite solidified into accusations. British athletics operated under a code of silence, where suspicions went unspoken and testing remained conveniently inadequate. Athletes trained in the same facilities, worked with the same coaches, and certainly discussed methods with each other. The knowledge spread organically through professional relationships and training camps where international athletes mixed. A Finnish sprinter mentioned something to a British hurdler, who told a German thrower, and suddenly everyone knew the open secret. Veterinary supply chains became the primary source for underground distribution. Clenbuterol manufactured for livestock remained legal and relatively easy to obtain with proper agricultural credentials. Veterinarians who served both animal clients and athlete clients found themselves in lucrative positions. A prescription written for a racehorse owner could easily disappear into a gym bag instead of a stable. Mexican and South American veterinary pharmaceutical companies produced clenbuterol in industrial quantities for cattle operations, and these supplies leaked northward through networks of distributors who asked few questions about ultimate end users. The stacking culture emerged from bodybuilding communities rather than traditional sports. Bodybuilders approached pharmacology with systematic experimentation that would have impressed actual pharmaceutical researchers. They documented cycles, tracked results, and shared information through underground publications and gym networks. Clenbuterol became the cutting phase staple, used during the 8 to 12 weeks before competitions, when the goal involved eliminating every trace of body fat while maintaining maximum muscle size. Stack it with trenbolone for muscle hardness. Add testosterone to maintain strength during the caloric deficit. Include thyroid hormone to accelerate metabolism even further. The combinations grew increasingly complex and dangerous as each generation of bodybuilders tried to exceed the previous generation's extremes. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off became gospel among regular users. The protocol emerged from trial and error rather than scientific research. Athletes noticed diminishing returns after continuous use beyond 2 weeks, correctly identifying receptor downregulation as the problem. Stopping for 2 weeks allowed beta-2 receptors to regenerate, restoring sensitivity to the drug. Some users extended to 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Others implemented complicated ramp-up and ramp-down strategies that supposedly minimize side effects while maximizing fat loss. The community developed expertise that rivaled academic knowledge, except their research subjects were themselves and the consequences included hospitalization or death, rather than failed experiments in laboratory mice. Information spread through an analog network that predated internet forums by a decade. Hardcore gyms in major cities became knowledge hubs where serious athletes and bodybuilders gathered. Someone who trained at Gold's Gym in Venice Beach might relocate to a facility in Chicago and bring West Coast methods with them. A British bodybuilder competing in Europe would learn continental techniques and import them home. Supplement store owners functioned as information brokers, connecting buyers with sellers while offering advice on usage despite lacking any medical qualifications. The system worked through personal relationships and word of mouth, creating an underground pharmaceutical distribution network that operated in plain sight. Print publications like Muscle and Fitness and Flex magazine never explicitly discussed illegal drugs, but athletes learned to read between the lines. Articles about professional bodybuilders' training splits and dietary approaches omitted the most crucial element of their programs, but readers understood the subtext. When a magazine profiled a 260-pound competitor with 4% body fat, every experienced gym member knew pharmaceutical assistance made those numbers possible. The silent agreement held. Professionals pretended they achieved everything naturally. Publications pretended to believe them, and readers pretended not to notice the obvious deception. Clenbuterol existed in this space of collective denial, where everyone knew and nobody said. The 1992 Barcelona Olympics represented Clenbuterol's coming-out party, though no official acknowledgement occurred. Athletes from dozens of countries arrived displaying physiques that challenged biological plausibility. Track sprinters looked like bodybuilders. Cyclists had visible muscle striations through their skin-tight suits. Swimmers cut through water with bodies sculpted to such extremes that even casual viewers noticed something had changed since previous Olympics. Testing protocols at Barcelona remained inadequate for detecting Clenbuterol, though officials must have suspected its presence given the visual evidence. The International Olympic Committee faced an impossible choice: either admit that testing couldn't catch contemporary doping methods, or maintain the fiction that Olympic competition remained clean despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. Chinese weightlifters at those same games raised particular suspicions. The team arrived seemingly from nowhere and dominated their weight classes with performances that shattered records. Their lean muscle mass and explosive power suggested pharmaceutical programs more sophisticated than most Western nations employed. Years later, After multiple positive tests for various substances, patterns emerged suggesting systematic doping dating back to at least the early 1990s. Clenbuterol almost certainly played a role in those programs, though proof remained elusive due to inadequate testing and Chinese Athletic Federation's resistance to international oversight. The drug's regulatory limbo accelerated its spread. Clenbuterol wasn't a controlled substance in most countries, meaning possession didn't constitute a criminal offence. Athletes caught with it faced sport-specific sanctions but not legal prosecution. This distinction mattered enormously for risk-averse users who wanted competitive advantages without criminal records. Customs officials sometimes seized Clenbuterol shipments at borders, but personal use quantities usually passed through without issue. The substance occupied a grey zone where it was simultaneously banned in competition, illegal for human use without prescription, but not criminalised at the level of heroin or cocaine. This regulatory confusion allowed widespread distribution, while authorities figured out appropriate responses. By 1995, Clenbuterol had become endemic in strength sports, combat sports, and any athletic endeavour where body composition influenced performance. Powerlifters used it to make weight classes. Boxers relied on it for pre-fight cuts. Mixed martial arts fighters, competing in a sport that barely existed yet, already incorporated Clenbuterol into training camps based on techniques borrowed from boxing and wrestling. The Olympic sports maintained their public facade of purity while privately dealing with the same issues. Every sport developed its own relationship with the drug, its own protocols and justifications, its own elaborate methods for avoiding detection during the narrow windows when testing occurred. The knowledge asymmetry between users and authorities guaranteed continued abuse. Athletes understood Clenbuterol's detection window lasted only days after cessation. Testing happened at specific times during competition seasons. The math was simple. Stop taking the drug 72 to 96 hours before testing. Pass the test. Resume use immediately afterward. Even when laboratories improved their detection capabilities, athletes adapted by cycling off earlier or using masking agents. The arms race between testing technology and evasion techniques favoured those willing to accept health risks for competitive glory. The underground network always moved faster than regulatory bodies could respond, and by the time authorities understood the previous generation of doping methods, athletes had already moved on to newer, more sophisticated approaches. Chinese livestock farmers discovered Clenbuterol's agricultural applications in the mid-1990s, and the discovery transformed food safety into an international crisis. Cattle treated with the drug developed leaner meat with better market value. Pigs reached slaughter weight faster while carrying less fat. The economic incentives made sense until someone calculated that Clenbuterol doesn't metabolize completely in animal tissue. Residues concentrate in organs, particularly liver and lungs, but also persist in muscle tissue that eventually reaches dinner plates. China banned Clenbuterol for livestock use in 2002 after numerous poisoning incidents, though enforcement remained theoretical in rural provinces where inspections happened rarely and bribes happened constantly. Mexico never banned the practice. Cattle operations throughout Jalisco, Sonora, and Chihuahua, states fed Clenbuterol to livestock openly, treating it as standard procedure rather than dangerous contamination. The drug helped ranchers meet export standards for lean beef while maximizing profit margins. Mexican agricultural authorities lacked resources for comprehensive testing, and what testing occurred focused on bacterial contamination rather than pharmaceutical residues. Meat containing Clenbuterol crossed into the United States daily through commercial channels, wound up in restaurants and grocery stores, and nobody detected anything wrong until people started getting sick or athletes started failing drug tests. The first major crisis hit Spain in early 2010. over 300 people across multiple provinces required hospitalization within a 2-week period. Symptoms included tachycardia, tremors, headaches, and nausea severe enough to warrant emergency intervention. Epidemiologists traced the outbreak to contaminated pork from a single supplier in Castile and Leon. Laboratory analysis found clenbuterol concentrations in the meat samples reaching 160 micrograms per kilogram, enough to cause acute toxicity in anyone eating standard portions. The supplier had obtained pigs from farms using veterinary clenbuterol to reduce fat content. Spanish health authorities ordered massive recalls and implemented emergency testing protocols, but the damage exposed how thoroughly the drug had infiltrated food supply chains. Athletes competing in Spain that summer faced an impossible dilemma. Eating local meat risked positive drug tests. Avoiding meat entirely risked inadequate protein intake during training. The World Anti-Doping Agency refused to grant blanket exemptions, stating athletes remained responsible for everything entering their bodies regardless of source. Several Spanish cyclists tested positive for trace clenbuterol amounts in regional competitions, all claiming contamination rather than deliberate use. Sports federations found themselves adjudicating cases where guilt or innocence couldn't be determined scientifically. Testing technology could detect clenbuterol, but couldn't distinguish between someone taking tablets and someone eating contaminated steak 3 days earlier. Alberto Contador's case became the defining contamination controversy. The Spanish cyclist won the 2010 Tour de France, his third victory in the sport's most prestigious race. On July 21st, during a rest day in Pau, he tested positive for clenbuterol at a concentration of 50 picograms per milliliter, an amount so small it barely registered above detection limits. Contador immediately claimed contaminated beef imported from Spain caused the positive test. His team presented receipts from a butcher shop and scientific analysis of similar meat from the same supplier showing clenbuterol residues. The explanation seemed plausible, given Spain's recent contamination crisis. The International Cycling Union initially accepted Contador's explanation and cleared him to continue racing. The World Anti-Doping Agency appealed, arguing that athletes bore strict liability for substances in their system regardless of how they got there. The Court of Arbitration for Sport heard evidence for 18 months, examining scientific testimony about contamination likelihood, pharmacokinetics of clenbuterol absorption from food, and statistical probability of the detected concentration resulting from either deliberate use or accidental consumption. Expert witnesses contradicted each other. Scientists disagreed about whether 50 picograms indicated recent high-dose use or historical consumption of contaminated meat. The verdict arrived in February 2012, nearly 2 years after the positive test. CAS found Contador guilty of doping violations despite acknowledging the contamination scenario was possible. The panel concluded that while contaminated meat might explain the positive test, strict liability rules meant athletes were responsible regardless of intent or negligence. Contador lost his 2010 Tour de France title, his 2011 Giro d'Italia victory, and received a 2-year suspension backdated to the positive test. The decision established precedent that contamination, even if genuine, didn't excuse positive tests. Athletes would need to prove contamination beyond reasonable doubt, an impossible standard given that testing methods couldn't determine how clenbuterol entered someone's system. Mexico's contamination problem dwarfed Spain's limited outbreak. The Mexican Soccer Federation issued official warnings in 2011, advising national team players to avoid meat while in the country. Boxing federations followed with similar advisories. The US Anti-Doping Agency published guidance recommending athletes minimize meat consumption when competing in Mexico or consuming Mexican meat products domestically. These warnings tacitly admitted that contamination wasn't rare or isolated, but systematic and widespread throughout Mexican agriculture. Athletes faced absurd precautions. Some travelled with portable protein powder supplies, others ate only fish and eggs. A few went temporarily vegetarian rather than risk their careers on contaminated beef. Eric Morales, a legendary Mexican boxer, tested positive for Clenbuterol in 2012 during preparation for a fight in Las Vegas. Morales had retired and returned to boxing at age 36, attempting one final run at glory. The positive test derailed his comeback and reinforced suspicions that even Mexican athletes couldn't avoid their own country's contamination crisis. Morales claimed he never knowingly used performance enhancers and attributed the positive to meat consumption in his hometown of Tijuana. Nevada Athletic Commission suspended him anyway, applying the same strict liability standard that caught Contador. The case illustrated how contamination affected both locals and visitors equally, making Mexico effectively radioactive for any athlete subject to drug testing. 5 Mexican players tested positive for Clenbuterol during the 2011 Gold Cup, a major soccer tournament hosted by the United States. CONCACAF, the regional soccer governing body, faced a crisis where eliminating every positive player would have forced Mexico to withdraw from the tournament. Scientific analysis suggested low concentrations consistent with contaminated meat, rather than performance enhancement. The Federation issued warnings and reprimands, but allowed the players to continue competing, establishing yet another precedent that contamination might result in leniency that deliberate use wouldn't receive. The decision outraged anti-doping advocates who argued it created loopholes large enough to drive cattle through. Jessica Hardy's positive test in 2008 preceded the contamination defense explosion, but demonstrated similar problems. The American swimmer tested positive for Clenbuterol at the Olympic trials, costing her a spot on the Beijing Olympics team. Hardy claimed contamination from a nutritional supplement she purchased from a health food store. Laboratory analysis of remaining supplement confirmed Clenbuterol presence, despite the label listing no such ingredient. Her case proved that contamination could occur through multiple pathways, not just meat, and that even careful athletes following proper supplement protocols faced risks from adulterated products manufactured in countries with minimal quality control. Cycling continued producing contamination cases with suspicious regularity. Chinese cyclist Li Fuyu tested positive during the 2016 Tour of Hainan, claiming local meat caused the violation. Spanish riders testing positive in domestic races routinely blamed regional beef. Mexican cyclists seem to fail test monthly, each claiming the same contamination defense their countrymen across sports deployed. The pattern became so common that officials developed informal skepticism. First, positive test with contamination claim might be legitimate. Second, suggested negligence. Third, indicated probable intentional use hidden behind convenient excuses. Testing laboratories improved their analytical capabilities, but couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry could detect Clenbuterol at increasingly smaller concentrations, reaching parts per trillion sensitivity. The technology proved the substance was present but offered no information about how it got there or when. Scientists proposed isotope ratio analysis to distinguish synthetic pharmaceutical Clenbuterol from naturally occurring compounds, but the technique required expensive equipment that most laboratories couldn't afford. Hair sample testing could establish longer-term use patterns, but couldn't be implemented retrospectively for cases already under adjudication. The threshold debate consumed scientific and regulatory attention for years. Should anti-doping agencies establish minimum concentrations below which positives would be considered likely contamination? Setting thresholds created opportunities for microdosing where athletes used small amounts that wouldn't exceed the limit. Maintaining zero-tolerance policies meant punishing potentially innocent athletes who unknowingly consumed contaminated food. The World Anti-Doping Agency ultimately maintained strict liability with case-by-case evaluation, a compromise that satisfied nobody and guaranteed continued controversy with every positive test. Athletes developed elaborate paranoia around meat consumption. Team nutritionists compiled lists of safe protein sources that minimized contamination risks. Some athletes switched entirely to plant-based diets during competition seasons, eliminating meat rather than accepting any risk. Others insisted on purchasing beef directly from specific farms with verified testing protocols. The ultra-cautious ate only chicken and fish, operating under the largely false assumption that contamination affected cattle and pigs exclusively. These precautions sometimes bordered on superstition, but reflected legitimate anxiety about career-ending positive tests from food that looked, tasted, and seemed identical to uncontaminated products. The Chinese Sports Federation faced particular challenges given their country's history as the contamination source. Chinese athletes competing internationally encountered suspicion regardless of testing results. Officials implemented internal meat bans for national team members, providing protein through carefully sourced alternatives. The Federation purchased testing equipment to screen food supplies at training centres, transforming athletic facilities into food safety laboratories. These measures reduced domestic positive tests but couldn't eliminate international skepticism that Chinese athletic success might involve both deliberate doping and convenient contamination excuses when athletes got caught. Court decisions created baffling inconsistencies where identical factual situations produced different outcomes. Contador lost his titles despite plausible contamination evidence. Other athletes with similar low concentrations and comparable contamination claims received warnings or short suspensions rather than full penalties. The variation depended partly on the specific arbitration panel hearing each case, partly on the quality of legal representation and scientific expert testimony, and partly on factors that seemed arbitrary from the outside. Athletes with resources to mount aggressive defences sometimes prevailed, where less wealthy or less connected athletes accepted guilt quietly. The livestock industry largely ignored these developments. Ranchers using Clenbuterol rarely faced prosecution even in countries where the practice was illegal. Agricultural inspections remained infrequent and penalties minimal when violations were discovered. Economic incentives for using Clenbuterol in livestock farming exceeded the risks of getting caught. Meat processors couldn't test every carcass for pharmaceutical residues without destroying profit margins. Consumers remained mostly unaware that their dinner might contain drugs designed for humans, repurposed for animals, and inadvertently consumed by people who never intended to take anything. The disconnect between athletic anti-doping programs and agricultural practices guaranteed that contamination would remain an unsolved problem, affecting food safety and sports integrity simultaneously. Hollywood discovered Clenbuterol around 2002, though whispers suggest earlier experimentation among actors who maintained unusually consistent physiques across decades. The entertainment industry operated under different constraints than professional athletics. No drug testing existed for film productions. Actors answered only to casting directors, producers, and audience expectations rather than anti-doping agencies. The transformation demands made athletic preparation cycles look reasonable by comparison. A studio might hire an actor in January for a shirtless superhero role shooting in April, creating an impossible 12-week window to achieve a physique that naturally required 6 months or more. The pharmaceutical cascade typically began 8 weeks before filming. Actors already in decent shape started Clenbuterol cycles immediately, stacking it with testosterone, growth hormone, and sometimes more exotic compounds that even experienced bodybuilders avoided. The goal wasn't mere fitness, but sculptural perfection that translated on camera under harsh lighting. Every vein needed to pop. Every muscle group required separation and definition. Body fat percentages dropped to levels that endocrinologists would flag as medically concerning. Dehydration protocols in the final 48 hours before shirtless scenes reduced subcutaneous water to create shrink-wrapped skin over muscle tissue. The results looked superhuman on screen because they weren't human in any sustainable sense. Celebrity trainers became gatekeepers for pharmaceutical knowledge that studios officially denied existed. These trainers charged premium rates not for workout programming, which any competent coach could provide, but for access to drugs and expertise in managing side effects. The relationship operated through careful verbal agreements where nothing was documented. Trainers never wrote prescriptions or provided substances directly. They simply made introductions to sports medicine doctors who understood what actors needed and asked few questions about medical necessity. The fees for these services sometimes exceeded the trainer's official compensation, paid in cash or through shell companies that obscured the actual nature of the transaction. Actors preparing for action franchises faced particularly intense pressure. Marvel and DC comic book adaptations demanded physiques that matched illustrated source material created by artists who never considered biological constraints. A role might require gaining 20 pounds of muscle while simultaneously losing 15 pounds of fat, a transformation that genetics and natural hormone levels couldn't accomplish in the available time frame. Clenbuterol became standard in the protocol alongside heavier pharmaceutical artillery. The drug's muscle-sparing properties made it essential during the severe caloric deficits actors endured while training twice daily and shooting 12-hour days. The dosing among actors often exceeded even aggressive bodybuilding protocols. Desperation and ignorance combined dangerously when people with no pharmaceutical experience suddenly had access to powerful drugs and short deadlines. Some actors took 200 micrograms daily, double what competitive bodybuilders considered maximum. The side effects became impossible to hide during production. Trembling hands required multiple takes for simple scenes. Insomnia left actors exhausted during shooting, requiring stimulants to maintain energy that then prevented sleep the following night. Heart palpitations struck during physically demanding sequences, sometimes forcing production delays that cost tens of thousands of dollars hourly, while the actor recovered enough to continue. Studios maintained plausible deniability through willful ignorance. Production companies hired trainers and doctors as independent contractors, rather than employees. If pharmaceutical use occurred, it happened outside official channels where studios bore no legal liability. Insurance companies covering production costs never inquired about enhancement drugs, because asking questions might obligate them to enforce restrictions that would make filming schedules impossible. Everyone involved understood the unspoken agreement: deliver the required physique on schedule, and nobody asks how you achieved it. Female actors faced even more impossible standards. Action heroines needed visible muscle definition while maintaining feminine physiques that traditional steroid use would masculinize. Clenbuterol offered fat loss without the androgenic effects that caused voice deepening, facial hair, and other virilizing changes. Actresses preparing for superhero roles or action films used the drug to achieve body fat percentages around 12 to 14%, low enough for significant muscle definition, but not so extreme as to disrupt menstrual cycles. The 8-week transformation timelines applied equally regardless of gender, creating identical pressure to use pharmaceutical shortcuts. The dosing protocols circulated through an informal network of trainers, doctors, and athletes who consulted on film productions. Information flowed from professional bodybuilders to celebrity trainers to actors, creating a knowledge chain where each link added distortion and risk. An experienced bodybuilder might manage 140 micrograms daily with proper electrolyte supplementation and cardiovascular monitoring. That same dose given to an actor without bodybuilding background and no medical oversight created disaster potential that manifested regularly but rarely publicly. Emergency room visits happened under pseudonyms. Complications were attributed to exhaustion or food poisoning rather than admitted pharmaceutical causes. The trickle-down effect transformed fitness culture across economic levels. Regular gym members saw actors transform rapidly for roles and assumed similar results were achievable naturally through sufficient dedication. Social media accelerated this delusion exponentially starting around 2010. Actors posted workout videos and diet tips while omitting the pharmaceutical foundation underlying their results. Fitness influencers copied celebrity transformations using the same drugs, but presented them as achievable through their training programs, which they sold as online coaching packages. The deception became multi-layered. Celebrities pretending to be natural, influencers copying celebrities while claiming natural methods, regular people copying influencers, and wondering why identical workouts produced inferior results. Underground steroid forums exploded with discussions of Clenbuterol starting around 2008. The same internet that enabled social media fitness culture also created spaces where people shared actual methods behind transformation photos. Users posted detailed cycle logs documenting Clenbuterol doses, side effects, results, and photographs. These forums operated in legal grey zones, hosted on servers in countries with lax enforcement, accessible to anyone with a search engine. Teenagers found them as easily as experienced bodybuilders. The information quality varied wildly from scientifically informed harm reduction advice to dangerous broscients that accelerated injury and death. Reddit's bodybuilding and fitness communities developed elaborate cultures around performance enhancement discussions. Moderators walked fine lines between harm reduction and facilitating illegal activity. Threads about Clenbuterol attracted thousands of comments, many from people with no prior drug use experience, asking basic questions about where to buy, how much to take, and whether side effects were normal. The responses came from anonymous users whose qualifications range from professional to completely fabricated. Someone might follow advice from a supposed IFBB professional who was actually a 17-year-old repeating information from a forum post he'd read the previous week. The supplement industry responded to Clenbuterol's popularity by flooding the market with supposed alternatives. Products labelled Clenbuterol, Clenbuterus, or similar names filled shelves at nutrition stores and flooded online marketplaces. The ingredients typically included caffeine, bitter orange extract, and various other stimulants that provided jittery energy without the actual fat-burning effects users wanted. These supplements were completely legal, totally ineffective, and sold in massive volumes to people hoping to find Clenbuterol results without the legal risks or side effects. The industry profited from confusion, while actual Clenbuterol circulated through parallel distribution channels, serving informed buyers who understood the supplement aisle contained no useful shortcuts. Actual Clenbuterol remained easy to obtain despite its quasi-legal status. Research chemical companies sold it openly online, often labelled for research purposes only, or not for human consumption, to provide legal cover. These companies operated from addresses in Florida, Nevada, and other states with minimal supplement regulation. Payment processing happened through normal merchant accounts, because Clenbuterol wasn't a controlled substance requiring special banking restrictions. Customers bought it as casually as protein powder, receiving packages through regular mail delivery. Law enforcement rarely intervened because personal use quantities didn't rise to the threshold for federal investigation, and local police had bigger priorities than gym members buying fat loss drugs. The cultural contradiction reached absurd extremes. Society demanded that actors achieve impossible physiques, while simultaneously criminalizing and stigmatizing the methods required. Magazine covers featured shredded celebrities, alongside articles about body positivity and accepting natural body types. Instagram algorithms promoted fitness transformations that required pharmaceutical assistance, while banning explicit drug discussion. Actors who admitted using steroids for roles faced career consequences, while actors who lied about natural transformations received praise for dedication and work ethic. The collective delusion allowed everyone to maintain comfortable fictions about human physical potential. Young actors entering the industry discovered these realities through uncomfortable conversations with trainers and more experienced performers. The first time someone explained that the 6-month preparation timeline was actually 6 weeks of training, plus 8 weeks of pharmaceutical enhancement, the newcomer faced a choice. Accept that career advancement might require compromising health and values, or accept that leading roles would go to competitors willing to make that compromise. Most chose pragmatically, rationalizing that everyone else was doing it, and refusing meant permanent disadvantage. The pressure operated through pure economic logic. Studios paid tens of millions for actors who delivered required results, and nobody paid for natural physiques that looked unimpressive on screen. The few actors who admitted pharmaceutical use faced immediate backlash, despite telling obvious truths. When occasional performers acknowledged steroid or growth hormone use during interviews, they were labelled as cheaters, undermining natural fitness enthusiasts rather than praised for honesty. The entertainment media dropped these admissions quickly, preferring to maintain narratives about dedication and sacrifice. Fitness magazines that covered actors' preparation regimens ignored pharmaceutical reality completely, publishing articles about workout splits and meal plans while omitting the most important variables. Readers followed these programs religiously and blamed themselves when results didn't match expectations, never suspecting they were following incomplete instructions deliberately designed to fail without pharmaceutical assistance. The situation created strange market dynamics, where actual Clenbuterol remained illegal for human use, but effectively available to anyone with internet access and a credit card. Meanwhile, worthless legal supplements sold for premium prices to people seeking the same results through officially sanctioned channels. Trainers charged enormous fees for knowledge that circulated freely on forums. Doctors prescribed legitimate testosterone replacement therapy to men with normal hormone levels, establishing paper trails for what were functionally steroid cycles. Sports medicine became pharmaceutical facilitation, wearing medical credentials. The entire system operated through lies layered on lies, and Clenbuterol represented just one component of a much larger culture of enhancement and denial. The internet didn't just facilitate Clenbuterol distribution, it demolished every barrier between underground pharmaceutical knowledge and anyone with a search engine. Bodybuilding forums like Pro Muscle, Anabolic Minds, and Steroid.com transformed from niche communities in the late 1990s into encyclopedic databases by 2005. Users posted cycle logs documenting exact Clenbuterol protocols with pharmaceutical precision, dosing schedules, side effect management, stacking combinations, blood work results. The collective knowledge exceeded what most doctors understood about performance-enhancing drugs because forum members conducted experiments on themselves daily, generating real-world data that academic research couldn't replicate ethically. These forums operated through careful legal positioning. Administrators banned explicit source discussion in public threads, maintaining plausible deniability about facilitating drug transactions. private messaging systems allowed members to exchange supplier information outside moderator oversight. A new user would post questions about Clenbuterol, receive detailed responses about proper usage, then quietly receive private messages from established members offering to share vendor contacts. The system worked through unspoken protocols where everyone understood public discussions focused on information, while actual commerce happened invisibly. Bitcoin's emergence in 2009 revolutionized underground pharmaceutical markets by solving the payment problem. Credit card processors could track transactions and cooperate with law enforcement. Bank wire transfers left obvious paper trails. Cryptocurrency enabled truly anonymous purchases where neither buyer nor seller revealed identity or location. The Silk Road Marketplace launched in 2011, offering Clenbuterol alongside heroin, cocaine, and every pharmaceutical imaginable. Users accessed the site through Tor browsers that obscured their internet activity. Transactions happened in Bitcoin, which at the time cost a few dollars per coin and seemed like play money rather than the financial infrastructure for global black markets. Chinese pharmaceutical manufacturers dominated online Clenbuterol supply chains. Factories in Wuhan, Guangzhou, and Shanghai produced raw pharmaceutical powders in industrial quantities with minimal regulatory oversight. These operations manufactured legitimate medications for domestic and export markets, but also filled orders from international underground sources without distinguishing between legal and illegal customers. A single facility might produce Clenbuterol for European pharmaceutical companies during the day and package unmarked shipments for American bodybuilding suppliers at night. The factories didn't care about end-use or destination legality, only about payment clearing and production quotas being met. Quality control became a lethal roulette. Some underground suppliers sold pharmaceutical-grade Clenbuterol accurately dosed and properly manufactured. Others sold tablets pressed with random powders cut with enough active ingredient to produce some effects while maximizing profit margins. The worst vendors sold completely fake products containing nothing but filler, betting that customers couldn't distinguish between underdosed Clenbuterol and legitimate tablets without laboratory testing. Users found themselves gambling with every purchase, unable to verify product authenticity until they'd already consumed several doses and monitored results or side effects. The contamination incident started appearing on forums around 2008. A user in Michigan reported severe vomiting and diarrhea after starting a Clenbuterol cycle from a new supplier. His blood work showed liver enzymes elevated to levels suggesting acute poisoning. Laboratory analysis eventually revealed the tablets contained DNP, an industrial chemical used in explosives manufacturing that bodybuilders sometimes used as an extreme fat loss agent. DNP had a razor-thin margin between effective dose and lethal dose, and the contaminated Clenbuterol tablets contained amounts that nearly killed him. The supplier disappeared from the internet after that incident, only to resurface weeks later under a different name selling to customers who didn't know the history. Forum veterans tried implementing harm reduction through vendor review systems. Threads catalogued reliable suppliers with positive feedback and warned about scammers or dangerous products. The system worked imperfectly because vendors could create fake accounts to post positive reviews for themselves. Scammers would build reputation over months with legitimate products, then exit scam by taking orders and payments without shipping anything. Users lost thousands of dollars to vendors who simply vanished overnight, unreachable through email or messaging apps, impossible to pursue legally, because reporting the theft meant admitting to attempted illegal drug purchases. Federal enforcement agencies conducted periodic sweeps that created temporary disruptions without solving underlying problems. DEA and FDA coordinated raids on domestic supplement companies in 2007 during Operation Raw Deal, which targeted 56 labs across the country. The operation seized massive quantities of steroids, growth hormone, and Clenbuterol while arresting dozens of suppliers and distributors. News coverage emphasized the success. Within 6 months, new suppliers filled the vacuum left by arrested vendors. The Chinese manufacturers kept producing, and the demand hadn't decreased, so distribution networks simply reorganized around the missing players. Instagram's visual culture accelerated Clenbuterol normalization by creating fitness influencer careers built on pharmaceutical-enhanced physiques. Users with impressive transformations attracted hundreds of thousands of followers, monetizing their audiences through supplement sponsorships, training programs, and online coaching. Nearly all claimed natural status despite maintaining year-round conditioning that required aggressive pharmaceutical protocols. These influencers posted daily updates showing their meals, workouts, and bodies, creating parasocial relationships where followers felt they knew the person intimately. The trust generated through this intimacy made followers receptive when influencers recommended products or training approaches, none of which worked without the drugs the influencer used but never mentioned. The coded language developed organically as platforms cracked down on explicit drug discussion. Clen became standard shorthand. On a cut or cutting phase implied Clenbuterol use to informed audiences. My coach has me on a special protocol meant pharmaceutical assistance without naming specifics. Influencers discussed being enhanced or using help rather than saying steroids or Clenbuterol. Direct message conversations used even more explicit terminology, with influencers sometimes serving as middlemen between their followers and underground suppliers. The commercial incentive was obvious. Influencers earned referral fees for directing customers to specific vendors while maintaining public denial about their own use. Telegram channels became the preferred marketplace by 2016. The messaging app offered encryption, large group capacity, and minimal content moderation compared to mainstream platforms. Suppliers created channels advertising products directly to thousands of subscribers. Listings included Clenbuterol from multiple manufacturers with prices, shipping terms, and customer service contacts. Some channels operated like professional storefronts with product catalogs, payment instructions, and tracking number updates. Others were obvious scams run by the same people who'd been exit scamming forum users for a decade, now targeting a new generation that didn't know the old warning signs. Discord servers created community spaces where buyers and sellers interacted more directly than previous platforms allowed. Voice chat enabled real-time discussions about sources and protocols. Screen sharing let experienced users walk newcomers through purchasing processes. These servers often required invitation or existed behind application processes where administrators vetted new members to avoid law enforcement infiltration. The larger servers hosted thousands of users, functionally operating as underground pharmaceutical marketplaces more organized than street drug networks. Moderators enforced rules, banned scammers, and maintained vendor accountability better than anonymous forums ever could. Teenagers found these communities with minimal effort. A high school student wondering how fitness influencers got so shredded could progress from Google search to YouTube videos to Reddit discussions to Discord servers in an afternoon. The path led inexorably toward pharmaceutical solutions, and nobody along the way asked for identification or warned about health risks. 16-year-olds ordered Clenbuterol to their parents' houses, paying with prepaid debit cards or Bitcoin purchased through apps that didn't verify age properly. The drugs arrived in generic packaging that didn't announce contents, and parents remained oblivious that their son's dramatic fat loss resulted from bronchodilators developed for middle-aged asthma patients. Law enforcement capabilities hadn't kept pace with internet-enabled distribution. International mail screening caught only a tiny fraction of pharmaceutical shipments, usually through random inspection or customs agents recognizing suspicious packaging. Most packages sailed through without examination, delivered by postal workers who had no idea they were facilitating drug distribution. Even when packages were intercepted, consequences were minimal. The recipient could claim ignorance about package contents. Proving intent to possess illegal substances required more evidence than seized mail provided. Customs would send a letter stating the package was confiscated, and that was usually the end of it. Federal agencies prioritized opioid and methamphetamine investigations over performance-enhancing drugs that didn't cause visible addiction crises. Clenbuterol users weren't dying in dramatic enough numbers to justify major resource allocation. Local police departments lacked expertise to investigate pharmaceutical distribution that happened entirely online through international networks. State-level drug task forces focused on street dealers and prescription pill mills rather than bodybuilders buying fat-loss drugs through cryptocurrency. The enforcement gap meant that Clenbuterol distribution operated with effective impunity, occasionally disrupted by high-profile busts but never substantially decreased. The sophistication of underground operations rivaled legitimate pharmaceutical supply chains. Major vendors maintained inventory, hired customer service representatives, implemented quality control testing, and developed brand reputations worth protecting. Some suppliers operated for 5 or 10 years without interruption, shipping thousands of orders monthly. They paid for advertising on bodybuilding websites, sponsored athletes in regional competitions, and functioned as actual businesses except for the detail that their core product was illegal for the intended use. These operations generated millions in annual revenue, enough to hire lawyers, pay bribes when necessary, and relocate operations when heat increased. Cryptocurrency tracing eventually caught some large suppliers. Blockchain analysis companies developed tools to track Bitcoin transactions, identifying patterns that revealed real-world identities behind supposedly anonymous wallets. Federal investigators used these techniques to dismantle several major vendors in 2019 and 2020, seizing cryptocurrency accounts worth millions and arresting operators who thought they were untouchable. The cases made headlines briefly before disappearing from public consciousness. New vendors appeared immediately, some operated by the same people through new fronts, others by competitors who saw market opportunities when established players were removed. The current marketplace made Clenbuterol more accessible than many over-the-counter medications. Buying Sudafed required showing identification to pharmacists because the decongestant could be used to manufacture methamphetamine. Purchasing Clenbuterol required typing a few words into a search engine, choosing from dozens of vendors, and waiting for international delivery. The irony wasn't lost on people who needed to show ID for cold medicine while ordering pharmaceutical drugs from China without any verification. The regulatory system protected against meth production more effectively than it prevented steroid distribution, suggesting priorities that made sense from certain policy angles, but seemed absurd from consumer perspectives. Research chemical companies provided the thinnest legal veneer for semi-legitimate sales. These businesses sold Clenbuterol and similar compounds, with disclaimers stating products were for research purposes only and not intended for human consumption. The disclaimers satisfied legal requirements while everybody involved understood the actual use case. Credit card processors accepted payments from these companies because technically they sold legal research chemicals. Package delivery companies shipped the products through normal channels. The entire system operated in plain sight, exploiting loopholes nobody seemed motivated to close, because doing so would require legislative action against products that weren't causing the type of social harm that generates political pressure. The normalization extended beyond athletics into casual fitness culture. Regular people with office jobs and families decided they wanted visible abs for summer and ordered Clenbuterol as casually as buying vitamins. the drug lost its association with serious bodybuilding and became just another lifestyle enhancement option, like Adderall for studying or Viagra for sex. The danger didn't decrease with increased access. If anything, casual users faced more risks because they lacked the pharmaceutical knowledge that experienced bodybuilders accumulated. They didn't know about electrolyte supplementation, receptor downregulation, or warning signs that side effects were escalating toward medical emergencies. They just wanted to look good at the beach and figured a pill was easier than months of disciplined dieting. Emergency room physicians started recognizing a pattern around 2010. Young men in excellent physical condition would arrive complaining of chest pain and heart rates exceeding 160 beats per minute. The initial presentation suggested cardiac events requiring immediate intervention, but EKGs showed sinus tachycardia without the ST segment changes indicating actual heart attacks. Blood tests revealed no troponin elevation that would confirm myocardial damage. These patients were having cardiac emergencies without technically having heart attacks, a distinction that mattered medically but not experientially. They felt like they were dying because their cardiovascular systems were operating at levels that shouldn't be sustainable for more than minutes, yet the crisis persisted for hours. The patients almost always lied initially. They claimed to have taken nothing, to be completely natural athletes who just worked out hard. Doctors would administer beta blockers to slow heart rates while running toxicology screens that came back negative for common stimulants like cocaine and methamphetamine. Only after repeated questioning, sometimes when the patient was alone with a single nurse rather than surrounded by the full emergency team, would the truth emerge. They'd been taking Clenbuterol, usually for weeks, often at doses that horrified medical professionals who understood the drug's pharmacology. The confession changed nothing about treatment, but explained the puzzle of why a 24-year-old with a resting heart rate of 170 showed no other signs of pathology. Beta blockers provided temporary relief by antagonizing the same receptors that Clenbuterol overstimulated. The patient's heart rate would drop to more manageable levels, allowing them to be observed for several hours before discharge. Doctors would warn them about the dangers, explain that they'd nearly caused permanent cardiac damage, emphasize that continuing use could kill them. The patients would nod seriously, promise to stop, and return to the same emergency room 6 months later with identical symptoms because the 8-week break had convinced them the drug was safe now that their system had reset. The medical staff recognized repeat visitors but couldn't force compliance or report them to anyone, so they treated the same preventable emergencies repeatedly. Hyperkalemia emerged as the silent killer that physicians feared most. Clenbuterol shifts potassium from bloodstream into cells, dropping serum levels sometimes below 2.5 milliequivalents per litre, when normal range started at 3.5. Low potassium disrupts electrical signaling in the heart, creating conditions where fatal arrhythmias can strike without warning. A patient might feel fine one moment and collapse the next as their heart suddenly shifted into ventricular fibrillation. The medical literature documented cases of previously healthy young adults found dead in gyms or homes, autopsies revealing hearts with no structural abnormalities, but toxicology screens showing Clenbuterol and catastrophically low potassium levels. One case from 2015 detailed a 28-year-old bodybuilder admitted to a Chicago hospital, unable to move his arms or legs. He'd been taking 160 micrograms of Clenbuterol daily for 3 weeks, without electrolyte supplementation. His potassium had dropped to 1.9, a level that should have stopped his heart but somehow hadn't. The hyperkalemia caused temporary paralysis, a condition called hyperkalemic periodic paralysis that occurs when muscles can't receive proper electrical signals from nerves. He spent 4 days in the ICU receiving aggressive potassium replacement, while doctors monitored his cardiac rhythm continuously, waiting to see if his heart would stop. He survived but was warned that next time he might not wake up from the paralysis. Rhabdomyolysis struck users who combined clenbuterol with intensive training during severe caloric deficits. The condition occurs when muscle tissue breaks down faster than the body can clear the debris. Damaged muscle releases proteins into the bloodstream that clog kidney filtration systems, potentially causing permanent renal failure. Symptoms included dark urine the colour of cola, extreme muscle pain beyond normal soreness, and rapidly progressing weakness. Users sometimes dismissed early warning signs as normal training stress, continuing their protocols until kidney function had deteriorated critically. Dialysis could save them, but some emerged with chronic kidney disease requiring lifelong medical management because they wanted visible abs for a beach vacation. Deaths that made medical literature represented only the documented fraction. A 32-year-old fitness model in Los Angeles collapsed during a photo shoot in 2013, dying before paramedics arrived. Autopsy found clenbuterol along with testosterone, trenbolone, and thyroid hormone in his system. The medical examiner attributed death to cardiac arrhythmia caused by drug interactions, but couldn't determine which specific combination proved lethal. His death generated local news coverage before disappearing from public consciousness. Friends posted tributes on social media, carefully avoiding mention of pharmaceutical use while calling his death unexpected and urging others to get regular checkups, as if heart exams would have prevented the consequences of multi-drug abuse. A Brazilian bodybuilder's death in 2017 revealed the international scope of clenbuterol casualties. Ricardo Santos had won regional competitions and accumulated a significant Instagram following by documenting his training and physique progress. At 26, he collapsed at home while preparing for a national competition. His girlfriend found him unresponsive and called emergency services, but he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Toxicology identified clenbuterol, various anabolic steroids, and diuretics used to eliminate water retention before competitions. The combination had caused electrolyte imbalances severe enough to stop his heart. Brazilian media covered the story for a few days before moving on, and his Instagram page remained active with comments from followers who didn't realize he was dead. Chronic cardiac damage accumulated silently in users who avoided acute emergencies. Heart muscle subjected to sustained elevated workload developed hypertrophy, thickening in ways that impaired function rather than improving it. Young men in their 20s developed left ventricular hypertrophy patterns, normally seen in elderly patients with decades of untreated hypertension. The hearts grew larger but weaker, pumping less efficiently despite increased muscle mass. Some users developed premature atrial fibrillation, an irregular heart rhythm that required lifelong anticoagulation to prevent stroke risk. They were 30 years old, taking the same blood thinners as 70-year-olds, all for physiques they'd maintained for maybe 3 years before the damage became undeniable. Anxiety disorders persisted long after clenbuterol use ended. The drug's effects on the central nervous system didn't always reverse completely when users stopped taking it. Some developed generalized anxiety that required psychiatric medication and therapy to manage. Others experienced panic attacks triggered by anything that elevated heart rate, including normal exercise or stressful situations. The neurological damage manifested as permanent alterations in stress response systems, leaving users psychologically fragile in ways they'd never been before starting clenbuterol. Psychiatrists treating these patients sometimes didn't know about the drug history because patients concealed it, leading to misdiagnoses and ineffective treatment approaches. The 19-year-old who wanted six-pack abs for his first summer after high school spent a week in intensive care. He weighed 140 pounds and took dosing advice from a forum user who weighed 220, not understanding that drug effects scaled with body mass and individual sensitivity. At 120 micrograms daily, his smaller frame experienced proportionally massive overdose effects. The tremors became so severe he couldn't hold a phone to call for help. His mother found him barely conscious in his bedroom, heart rate over 180, skin burning with fever from excessive thermogenesis. The ICU admission probably saved his life, though he'd face years of cardiac monitoring and anxiety issues. His mother found the Clenbuterol tablets hidden in a supplement container, innocent-looking pills that nearly killed her son. The 34-year-old mother using Clenbuterol to lose baby weight developed cardiac arrhythmias that required a procedure called catheter ablation. Doctors threaded instruments through blood vessels into her heart to destroy the tissue, causing irregular electrical patterns. The procedure carried its own risks, but was necessary because medication alone couldn't control the rhythm disturbances Clenbuterol had created. She'd taken the drug for only 6 weeks at moderate doses, nowhere near the extremes that bodybuilders used, but her individual sensitivity made even that exposure catastrophic. The ablation worked partially, leaving her with residual arrhythmias requiring lifelong medication. She was young enough that the drugs needed to control her heart rhythm might cause problems with future pregnancies, potentially forcing her to choose between having another child and managing her cardiac condition. The semi-professional MMA fighter built his career on Clenbuterol-enhanced weight cuts. He competed at welterweight, but his natural weight sat closer to middleweight. Every fight camp involved aggressive pharmaceutical protocols to drop 20 pounds while maintaining strength and endurance. The repeated cycles accumulated damage that he dismissed as normal wear from combat sports. By 28, his cardiologist delivered devastating news. His heart function had deteriorated to an ejection fraction of 35%, where normal started at 55. He had the cardiac output of someone decades older with advanced heart disease. Retirement was mandatory unless he wanted to die in the cage or shortly after. His fighting career had lasted 6 years, and the damage was permanent. Medical professionals treating these cases faced profound frustration. They could prescribe Clenbuterol safely for legitimate asthma patients, carefully dosing and monitoring for side effects. The same drug in unmonitored underground use became a cardiac time bomb. Doctors saw the evidence arriving in emergency rooms, but couldn't reach the population at risk. The users were healthy young people who avoided doctors except during crises, obtained drugs through channels completely outside medical oversight, and dosed themselves based on internet advice from anonymous strangers. The medical system had no intervention point until damage was already done. Reporting requirements complicated matters. Doctors in most jurisdictions weren't obligated to report steroid or Clenbuterol use to authorities, and doing so would violate patient confidentiality. Even when patients admitted to criminal behavior during medical treatment, physicians were bound by ethical codes prioritizing treatment over law enforcement. This created a bizarre situation where emergency room physicians knew exactly what substance caused a patient's crisis, knew that patient would likely return to the same dangerous behavior, and could do nothing beyond treating acute symptoms and offering warnings that were routinely ignored. Statistical reality suggested that documented cases represented a tiny fraction of actual harm. Most Clenbuterol users never ended up in emergency rooms. They experienced concerning symptoms like palpitations, chest tightness, or severe tremors, but powered through without seeking medical attention. The cardiac damage accumulated without acute crises that forced intervention. These users might present with heart problems years later, by which point connecting symptoms to prior Clenbuterol use became impossible. The drug would have cleared their system, and unless they volunteered their history, doctors would attribute heart damage to unknown causes or genetic predisposition. Underground forums occasionally reported deaths within their communities. A respected veteran user would stop posting, and eventually someone would share news that he died of cardiac arrest or been found dead at home. The community would mourn briefly, sometimes swearing off Clenbuterol entirely, then slowly returned to previous behaviours as the emotional impact faded. Nobody maintained comprehensive statistics on these deaths. No organisation tracked how many people died from complications of performance-enhancing drugs because the deaths were scattered, often attributed to other causes, and occurred among populations not studied systematically by public health researchers. The youth and health of victims made each case particularly tragic. These weren't 60-year-old cardiac patients with multiple risk factors, facing expected complications from chronic disease. They were 22-year-old athletes with their entire lives ahead of them, who destroyed their hearts chasing aesthetics that would have faded with age anyway. Their families rarely understood what happened because the deceased had hidden their drug use. Parents grieved while reading through their child's social media posts full of fitness inspiration and positive messages, never knowing that behind the motivational content was pharmaceutical abuse that ultimately proved fatal. Medical examiners performing autopsies sometimes found hearts that told stories of extreme abuse, enlarged, scarred, with electrical conduction systems disrupted by chronic overstimulation. The hearts of 25-year-olds resembled hearts of people who'd survived multiple heart attacks in their 60s. Toxicology reports revealed Clenbuterol alongside arsenals of other drugs, creating pharmacological combinations that no clinical trial had ever studied for safety. The medical examiners would document findings, file reports, and move on to the next autopsy. Nobody compiled this data into comprehensive warnings that might reach the at-risk population, and even if they did, the warnings would likely be dismissed as exaggerated fear-mongering by people convinced they had everything under control. The World Anti-Doping Agency added Clenbuterol to its prohibited substances list in the early 2000s, classifying it under S3, beta-2 agonists. The regulation looked decisive on paper. In practice, it accomplished almost nothing. Detection windows for Clenbuterol range from 4 to 6 days depending on dose and individual metabolism, a time frame short enough that athletes could cycle off before competitions and pass tests cleanly. Out-of-competition testing theoretically closed this loophole by conducting random tests during training periods, but the number of tests never matched the number of athletes. Somebody competing in cycling might face 3 or 4 random tests annually, leaving 361 days when Clenbuterol use carried no detection risk whatsoever. The contaminated meat defense created enforcement paralysis. After Alberto Contador's case established that low Clenbuterol concentrations might result from food rather than deliberate doping, every positive test became contestable. Athletes caught with 50 picograms per milliliter could claim they'd eaten beef in Mexico or pork in China, scenarios plausible enough that absolute proof of intentional use became impossible. Testing laboratories could confirm Clenbuterol's presence, but couldn't determine origin. This fundamental limitation meant that regulations existed without reliable enforcement mechanisms, transforming prohibited substance lists into suggestions that sophisticated users navigated easily. International legal frameworks varied so wildly that calling Clenbuterol illegal meant nothing without specifying jurisdiction. The United States classified it as a prescription medication prohibited for human use outside legitimate medical treatment, but not scheduled as a controlled substance under the Controlled Substances Act. Simple possession wasn't criminal. Distribution for human consumption violated FDA regulations, but enforcement focused on manufacturers and large-scale distributors rather than individual users or personal trainers supplying athletes. Canada maintained similar policies. Australia took a harder stance, scheduling Clenbuterol as a prescription-only medicine with significant penalties for unauthorized possession, but even there enforcement remained minimal. European countries each developed their own approaches based on local pharmaceutical traditions and regulatory philosophies. Some nations allowed Clenbuterol prescriptions for legitimate respiratory conditions, creating supplies that leaked into black markets. Others banned it entirely for human use, while permitting veterinary applications. The regulatory patchwork meant that substances legal in one EU nation were criminal in another, despite open borders allowing free movement. A bodybuilder could legally purchase Clenbuterol in Portugal, drive to France where possession violated law, and face no border inspection because Schengen Agreement eliminated customs checks. The enforcement regime assumed criminality would respect international boundaries that physical goods crossed freely. Customs agencies intercepted thousands of Clenbuterol shipments annually, but made negligible impact on overall supply. Chinese pharmaceutical exports moved through postal systems and express delivery services at volumes that overwhelmed inspection capabilities. Screening every package would require resources no customs agency possessed, and create delays that would paralyze international commerce. Random inspection caught maybe 2 to 5% of contraband, and even successful interceptions rarely led to prosecutions. Customs would seize the package, send a letter to the intended recipient stating contents violated import regulations, and that concluded the matter. The recipient lost their order but faced no charges. They simply placed another order with a different vendor, and statistical probability suggested the replacement package would arrive without incident. Operation Cyber Juice in 2005 targeted online steroid and human growth hormone distribution, incidentally catching Clenbuterol suppliers in the dragnet. Federal agents from DEA, FDA, and IRS coordinated raids across multiple states, arresting 124 people and seizing $56 million in assets. The operation received significant media coverage, emphasizing law enforcement's commitment to stopping performance-enhancing drug distribution. Within 12 months, underground forums reported that supply disruptions had normalized and new vendors had filled every gap created by arrests. The operation succeeded tactically, but failed strategically because it removed individuals from a market structure that immediately regenerated around new participants. Operation Raw Deal in 2007 represented an even larger enforcement effort, spanning international cooperation with Mexican and Canadian authorities. The operation resulted in 124 arrests in the United States, and numerous international arrests, seizures of 56 laboratories producing anabolic steroids and related drugs including Clenbuterol, and confiscation of millions of dosage units. DEA Administrator Karen Tandy announced the operation as the largest steroid enforcement action in American history. The statement was accurate but misleading about actual impact. Steroid prices increased briefly before returning to previous levels. Availability decreased for several months before recovering completely. The fundamental economics driving the market remained unchanged. Massive demand, low production costs, high profit margins, and minimal criminal penalties for most participants. Individual prosecutions that did proceed often resulted in sentences far lighter than headline charges suggested. A supplement company owner convicted of distributing thousands of Clenbuterol tablets might receive probation and fines rather than prison time. Judges sentencing these cases rarely viewed performance-enhancing drug distribution as serious criminal activity comparable to trafficking heroin or methamphetamine. Defense attorneys emphasized that defendants provided substances adults chose to take voluntarily, not addictive drugs destroying communities. Prosecutors sometimes agreed to plea deals, reducing charges significantly because they needed to allocate limited resources toward what they considered more dangerous criminal activity. The pharmaceutical industry's dual role complicated regulatory responses. Legitimate manufacturers like Boehringer Ingelheim continued producing Clenbuterol for respiratory treatment in countries where it remained approved. Their production happened under strict regulatory oversight, with quality controls ensuring accurate dosing and pharmaceutical purity. Some portion of this legitimate supply inevitably diverted into black markets through various mechanisms: employees stealing from production facilities, distributors selling to unauthorized purchasers, pharmacies reporting inventory theft that never occurred while selling stock underground. These diversions were impossible to eliminate without shutting down legitimate medical production entirely. Chinese pharmaceutical manufacturers operated under minimal oversight and produced the majority of raw clenbuterol powder circulating globally. These facilities range from actual pharmaceutical companies maintaining some quality standards to illegal operations that were basically chemical laboratories willing to synthesize anything customers would pay for. Chinese authorities conducted occasional raids and shut down facilities, but the industry operated at such scale that enforcement actions barely registered. The economic incentives were overwhelming. Western customers paid premium prices for products that cost very little to manufacture in China. A kilogram of raw clenbuterol powder, costing maybe $500 to produce, could sell for $50,000 or more after being pressed into tablets and distributed through underground networks. Veterinary use created an enforcement impossibility. Farmers worldwide used clenbuterol legally for livestock, meaning the substance had to remain available through agricultural supply channels. These channels intersected with human-use black markets at numerous points. Veterinarians wrote prescriptions that ended up in gyms. Agricultural suppliers sold to purchasers with dubious farming credentials. Pharmaceutical companies manufacturing veterinary clenbuterol couldn't control what happened after products left their distribution networks. Completely eliminating clenbuterol from agriculture would require international coordination that has never been achieved for any substance, and many countries refuse to ban agricultural use because the economic benefits to farmers outweighed concerns about human athletes obtaining diverted supplies. Sports anti-doping programs fought a perpetual arms race against athletes with months or years to prepare between tests. Testing technology improved constantly, with laboratories able to detect smaller concentrations of prohibited substances and identify metabolites that persisted longer than parent compounds. Athletes responded by adjusting timing of use, adding masking agents, or microdosing to stay below detection thresholds. Designer drugs emerged specifically to evade existing tests, though clenbuterol's long history made it less amenable to structural modification than newer compounds. The race between detection and evasion never reached equilibrium because both sides continued developing more sophisticated methods. The biological passport program attempted to shift the paradigm from detecting specific substances to identifying impossible physiological changes. Athletes established baseline blood and urine values over time, creating profiles that should remain relatively stable. Dramatic changes suggesting performance enhancement would trigger investigations regardless of whether specific drugs were detected. The program worked theoretically but struggled with implementation. Individual variation in physiology was large enough that determining impossible changes required extensive data and expert interpretation. Athletes could sometimes explain anomalies through legitimate factors like altitude training, illness, or dietary changes. The passport program caught some dopers, but couldn't eliminate pharmaceutical use by athletes who timed their cycles carefully and maintained values within individually established ranges. Enforcement priorities reflected political and social realities rather than objective harm assessments. Opioid epidemic dominated law enforcement attention and resources throughout the 2010s. Methamphetamine production and distribution received major focus. Cocaine trafficking remained a priority. Performance-enhancing drugs like clenbuterol barely registered as problems worth addressing when communities were being devastated by fentanyl overdoses killing thousands monthly. The comparative harm calculation made sense from public health perspectives, but meant that steroid and clenbuterol distribution operated with functional impunity. Local police departments investigating murders and property crimes had no capacity to pursue bodybuilders buying fat-loss drugs online. Federal agencies could justify devoting resources only to the largest operations. Athletic organizations demanding stricter anti-doping rules faced internal contradictions. Professional leagues wanted to maintain competitive integrity and protect player health, but also wanted peak athletic performance that drew fans and generated revenue. The spectacle of elite sports depended partly on pharmaceutical enhancement even when officially forbidden. Testing programs were implemented but designed with enough loopholes that sophisticated users could avoid detection. Suspensions happened publicly when athletes got caught, but the vast majority never faced consequences. The system created an illusion of enforcement while tacitly permitting widespread use by athletes who understood how to navigate testing schedules and detection windows. Policy paradoxes multiplied with each attempted solution. Increasing criminal penalties for distribution drove the market deeper underground, where product quality became even less reliable and health risks increased. Shutting down domestic suppliers shifted sourcing to international manufacturers beyond US jurisdiction. Tightening customs enforcement pushed distribution toward encrypted communication channels and cryptocurrency payments that were harder to trace. Every regulatory tightening created adaptations that made the overall situation more dangerous without significantly reducing availability. The war on drugs had demonstrated this pattern for decades, but authorities kept applying similar approaches to performance-enhancing substances while expecting different results. The regulatory system existed in a state of cognitive dissonance, where officials acknowledged problems without admitting their solutions had failed. Anti-doping agencies published annual statistics about tests conducted and violations detected, framing the data as evidence of effective enforcement. Athletes and industry insiders viewed the same statistics as proof that testing caught only the careless or unlucky, while sophisticated users continued undetected. Nobody in positions of authority wanted to admit that current approaches were failing comprehensively, because acknowledging failure would require either massive resource increases that weren't forthcoming or fundamental strategic changes that might look like surrender. Decriminalization debates occasionally surfaced before being quickly suppressed. Some harm reduction advocates argued that legal, regulated access to performance-enhancing drugs would be safer than prohibition driving everything underground. Athletes could obtain pharmaceutical-grade products with accurate dosing and medical supervision rather than unknown substances from criminal suppliers. The argument had logical merit but was politically impossible. Sports organizations built their legitimacy on competitive fairness that required prohibition of enhancement. Public health authorities couldn't endorse making drugs available for purposes outside medical necessity. The conversation never progressed beyond academic papers and online discussions, because institutional incentives all pointed toward maintaining prohibition, even when prohibition demonstrably wasn't working. The enforcement failure was complete, but could never be officially acknowledged. Clenbuterol remained technically prohibited in competition, available through black markets to anyone willing to take minimal risks, and used by a substantial percentage of competitive athletes despite regulations intended to prevent exactly that. The regulatory apparatus existed primarily to maintain appearances rather than to actually control distribution or use. Everyone involved understood this reality, but the collective fiction had to be maintained because admitting the truth would undermine the fundamental premise that sports were fair competitions between natural human abilities rather than pharmaceutical research programs competing through athlete proxies. Instagram launched in 2010 and within 3 years had transformed body image expectations more profoundly than any previous media. The platform's visual nature favored physiques over personality, aesthetics over substance. Fitness accounts exploded as users discovered that posting transformation photos or workout content generated massive engagement. The algorithm rewarded this content by promoting it to wider audiences, creating viral loops where the most extreme physiques received the most visibility. Nobody scrolling through their feed saw average bodies or realistic fitness results. They saw pharmaceutical-enhanced perfection presented as achievable through dedication and proper programming. The timeline disconnect created impossible standards that millions of people tried to meet. A fitness influencer would post dramatic before and after photos spanning 3 months, claiming the transformation resulted from their training program and meal plan. Followers would purchase the program, implement it religiously, and achieve maybe 20% of the promised results over the same time frame. The difference wasn't effort or genetics alone. The influencer had used Clenbuterol, testosterone, and possibly growth hormone to achieve changes that human physiology couldn't produce naturally in 3 months. But admitting pharmaceutical use would undermine their business model, so they maintained the fiction while collecting payment from people following incomplete instructions. TikTok accelerated the problem through its addictive algorithm and younger demographic. Teenage users spent hours daily consuming content from fitness creators showing their routines, meals, and bodies. The app's short video format encouraged extreme visual comparisons without context or nuance. A 17-year-old would see dozens of shredded physiques in a single scrolling session, each creator implying their body was attainable through natural methods. The psychological impact was devastating. Young people compared themselves to pharmaceutical-enhanced standards without knowing they were enhanced, then blamed themselves for failing to achieve impossible results through natural means. The competitive pressure operated through pure social dynamics rather than official competition. High school wrestlers didn't need to win state championships to feel pressure about weight cutting. They just needed teammates using Clenbuterol to drop weight while maintaining strength, creating competitive disadvantage for anyone refusing pharmaceutical assistance. College football players faced similar dynamics where roster spots went to whoever could get the biggest and strongest fastest. Weekend warriors at local CrossFit boxes competed informally through posted workout scores, and those scores climbed when users supplemented naturally limited athletic capacity with drugs that extended endurance and recovery. Amateur bodybuilding competitions created particularly toxic environments. Regional shows that paid no prize money and offered no professional opportunities attracted competitors willing to use the same pharmaceutical protocols as IFBB professionals. The judges expected a certain look, and achieving that look naturally was impossible for most genetic profiles within reasonable timeframes. First-time competitors would show up having prepared naturally, only to realize they looked completely outclassed by everyone else on stage. The next competition cycle, they'd be using Clenbuterol and steroids too, because losing repeatedly wasn't psychologically sustainable when victory required only pharmaceutical access rather than superior genetics or work ethic. Women faced exponentially worse pressure because feminine beauty standards encompassed narrower physical parameters than masculine ideals. Men could be large and muscular or lean and athletic, and both were considered attractive. Women needed to be thin, but with curves in specific places, toned but not bulky, strong but still traditionally feminine. Clenbuterol appealed to female users because it delivered fat loss without the masculinizing effects of androgenic steroids. A woman could take Clenbuterol to achieve body fat percentages low enough for significant muscle definition, without developing deeper voice, facial hair, or other virilizing characteristics that made steroid use obvious and socially punished. Instagram fitness models who built careers on their physiques faced impossible maintenance pressures. Once you've established an audience based on looking a certain way, losing that look meant losing your income. Female influencers couldn't take breaks from Clenbuterol during off-seasons because there were no off-seasons. They needed to maintain photo-ready condition year-round, posting content constantly to satisfy algorithmic demands and audience expectations. The pharmaceutical protocols became permanent lifestyle requirements rather than temporary preparation phases. Some female influencers had been using Clenbuterol continuously for years, accepting cardiac risks and other health consequences because their financial survival depended on maintaining impossible physiques. The fitness industry's complicity extended beyond individual influencers to the corporate structures supporting them. Supplement companies sponsored athletes with pharmaceutical-enhanced physiques, knowing their products contributed nothing to those results, but marketing them as if they did. Gym chains featured enhanced athletes in advertising, while officially opposing drug use. Fitness magazines published training articles written by competitors using extensive pharmaceutical protocols without mentioning the drugs, creating the impression that following the published routine would produce similar results. Everyone profited from the deception while maintaining official positions against enhancement. Supplement retailers occupied particularly cynical positions. They sold protein powders, pre-workout stimulants, and fat burners that provided marginal benefits, while the employees behind the counter quietly directed serious customers toward underground steroid sources. The retail space functioned as a legitimate business fronting for pharmaceutical distribution networks. Customers would buy supplements publicly while exchanging contact information for later transactions involving actual performance-enhancing drugs. The economic model worked because the legal supplements provided cover and revenue while the illegal drugs generated much larger profits through direct connections established in store. The philosophical question of competitive fairness became impossible to resolve. If enhancement was widespread across a sport or competitive domain, did abstaining represent ethical integrity or just competitive stupidity? Natural bodybuilders competed in specific federations with rigorous drug testing, but even there, rumors suggested that sophisticated users evaded detection successfully. The clean competitions weren't necessarily clean, just better at hiding pharmaceutical use. This reality forced individual athletes to choose between maintaining natural status that might guarantee permanent disadvantage or accepting enhancement to compete on level playing fields that weren't actually level, because dosing and response varied so dramatically between individuals. Natural bodybuilding federations implemented polygraph testing alongside urinalysis, trying to catch users who'd cycled off before competition. The polygraphs were arguably more reliable than drug tests because they detected lies about past use rather than current presence. But polygraphs were legally questionable, not admissible in court, and could be beaten by sociopaths who felt no stress lying. The testing arms race escalated to interrogation techniques, while athletes developed counters for every measure. Some users believed their own lies so thoroughly that polygraphs couldn't detect deception. The entire system created absurd theatre, where everyone pretended natural competition existed while acknowledging privately that pharmaceutical use was probably universal. Online debates about natty or not consumed fitness communities with obsessive intensity. Users would post photos of physiques and argue about whether the person had achieved results naturally or used drugs. These discussions revealed collective confusion about human physical potential. Some people thought physiques were impossible natural when they were difficult but achievable. Others insisted obviously enhanced individuals were natural because they didn't want to believe their goals required pharmaceutical assistance. The inability to distinguish between natural and enhanced physiques by visual assessment alone meant people set goals based on enhanced bodies, while believing those bodies were naturally attainable. The fake natty label became one of the worst insults within fitness communities. It meant someone claiming natural status while obviously using drugs, profiting from the lie by selling programs or supplements to people who believe the natural claim. The accusation carried such weight because it represented ultimate hypocrisy, using pharmaceutical advantages while claiming superiority through hard work and genetics, then monetizing the deception by selling false hope. Influencers accused of being fake natties often responded with outrage and lawsuits, which sometimes revealed they were indeed natural and sometimes confirmed suspicions through protests that seemed performative. Generational attitudes shifted dramatically toward acceptance of pharmaceutical enhancement. Millennials who came of age in the 1990s and 2000s generally maintained the fiction that elite physiques were natural achievements. Gen Z, having grown up with internet access to underground information, operated under fewer illusions. Younger people discussed enhancement more openly, debating health risks and ethical considerations rather than pretending drugs didn't exist. This transparency was healthier in some ways, but also normalized pharmaceutical use at younger ages when risk-taking and poor decision-making were already elevated by developmental factors. Teenage steroid use appeared to be increasing based on anonymous surveys and emergency room data, though comprehensive statistics remained elusive. Adolescents as young as 15 or 16 were accessing Clenbuterol and anabolic steroids through internet sources their parents couldn't monitor. The justifications were predictable. Everyone else was using. Natural methods were too slow. They wanted to look good for beach season, or impress girls, or get recruited for college athletics. The long-term consequences of manipulating hormonal systems during development were poorly studied but almost certainly negative. These teenagers were gambling with endocrine systems that hadn't finished maturing, potentially causing permanent damage for temporary aesthetic gains. High school locker rooms became informal pharmaceutical education centers where information spread through peer networks. The kid who got big fast would eventually reveal his methods to close friends, who would tell others, and knowledge cascaded through the student population. Teachers and coaches couldn't stop it because they often didn't know it was happening. Parents remained oblivious until something went wrong, and their son ended up in the emergency room or got caught with suspicious packages by postal workers who notified authorities. By then the damage was done, both physically and in terms of establishing patterns of pharmaceutical use that might continue for decades. College athletic programs faced impossible positions regarding enhancement. Officially, they tested athletes and punished violations. Unofficially, they knew that competitive success increasingly required pharmaceutical assistance that testing couldn't reliably detect. Coaches who wanted to keep their jobs needed to win, and winning required athletes who could train harder, recover faster, and build more muscle than their natural hormone levels allowed. Nobody said this explicitly, but the incentive structure was clear. Athletes understood that scholarship retention sometimes depended on performance levels that required pharmaceutical assistance to maintain. The normalization reached a point where online fitness communities discussed Clenbuterol cycles as casually as choosing between running and cycling for cardio. Forum threads about optimal dosing protocols, side effect management, and stacking strategies attracted thousands of comments from users treating pharmaceutical enhancement as just another training variable to optimize. The health risks were acknowledged but dismissed as manageable with proper precautions. Deaths were attributed to user error, improper dosing, or contaminated products rather than inherent dangers of putting your body into artificial metabolic crisis for weeks at a time. The philosophical acceptance of enhancement extended beyond athletics into broader life optimization culture. Silicon Valley executives microdosed psychedelics for creativity and took nootropics for cognitive performance. Students used Adderall to study and modafinil to stay awake. The body was just another system to hack, optimize, and push beyond natural limits through pharmaceutical interventions. Clenbuterol fit perfectly into this worldview as metabolic optimization, fat loss acceleration, and performance enhancement rather than doping with its negative connotations. The reframing transformed drug use from cheating into self-improvement, making it psychologically easier to rationalize the risks. Society demanded contradictory things. Natural achievements celebrated while making those achievements impossible through structural pressures that rewarded pharmaceutical enhancement. Fitness influencers faced this contradiction daily, needing enhanced physiques to attract audiences while claiming natural status to maintain credibility. The solution was collective denial, where everyone involved understood the truth but nobody spoke it openly. This unstable equilibrium depended on maintaining plausible deniability, and internet culture was slowly destroying that deniability by making information about enhancement methods freely available to anyone willing to search for it. The question wasn't whether enhancement would continue, but whether society would keep pretending it wasn't happening. Every teenager with a smartphone could find detailed Clenbuterol protocols within minutes. Every serious gym member knew multiple people using performance-enhancing drugs, even if nobody discussed it explicitly. The gap between official prohibition and actual practice had widened to a chasm, and that chasm was filled with pharmaceutical products flowing through distribution channels that law enforcement couldn't effectively disrupt. The cultural reckoning involved confronting these realities rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. But confrontation would require admitting that decades of anti-doping efforts had failed comprehensively, and that the goal of natural elite athletics might be fundamentally impossible in a world where enhancement was this accessible. Medical research on Clenbuterol continued in directions that had nothing to do with bodybuilders or athletes. Neuromuscular disease specialists investigated its potential for treating conditions like muscular dystrophy and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The drug's ability to prevent muscle wasting suggested applications for cancer patients experiencing cachexia or elderly people suffering age-related muscle loss. Clinical trials proceeded cautiously, exploring dosing protocols that provided therapeutic benefits without the cardiovascular complications that plagued athletic abuse. Researchers published promising results showing that low-dose Clenbuterol could slow muscle deterioration in patients with degenerative conditions, offering quality-of-life improvements that currently available medications couldn't match. The bitter irony was that legitimate patients who might benefit from Clenbuterol faced access barriers because of athletic abuse. Some countries had banned the drug entirely for human use, making it unavailable even through prescription for medical conditions that might justify its risks. Patients with muscular dystrophy or severe COPD couldn't obtain a medication that might genuinely help them because regulators feared it would be diverted to bodybuilders. The prohibition meant that people suffering debilitating muscle loss were denied pharmaceutical options while healthy athletes accessed the same drug illegally through black markets. Medical progress was being held hostage by enforcement concerns that weren't even successfully preventing the abuse they targeted. Spinal cord injury research revealed unexpected potential. Laboratory studies suggested Clenbuterol might promote nerve regeneration and muscle preservation in paralyzed tissue. The mechanisms weren't fully understood, but beta-2 receptor activation appeared to influence cellular processes beyond simple muscle metabolism. Early-stage trials in rodent models showed modest improvements in motor function recovery after induced spinal injuries. If these results translated to humans, Clenbuterol might become part of rehabilitation protocols for paralysis patients. But pharmaceutical companies hesitated to invest heavily in research for a drug that carried stigma from athletic doping scandals and faced regulatory uncertainty in multiple markets. Alternative beta-2 agonists emerged as pharmaceutical companies tried to develop compounds with Clenbuterol's benefits, but better safety profiles. Formoterol and salmeterol already existed as asthma medications with longer half-lives than older bronchodilators. Researchers investigated whether structural modifications could create versions that targeted fat metabolism more selectively without cardiac stimulation. The goal was finding the sweet spot, activating thermogenesis and muscle preservation without causing tachycardia and arrhythmias. Several candidates progressed through early development before being abandoned when trials revealed that the therapeutic window between effective and dangerous doses remained too narrow. Selective androgen receptor modulators created similar problems in different drug classes. SARMs were designed to provide anabolic steroid benefits for muscle building without androgenic side effects like prostate enlargement or virilization. The pharmaceutical industry invested billions developing these compounds for treating muscle-wasting diseases and hypergonadism. Before any SARM received FDA approval for medical use, underground distribution to bodybuilders and athletes had already begun. The pattern repeated exactly. Drugs developed for legitimate medical purposes immediately diverted to performance enhancement, creating regulatory complications that hindered medical approval while failing to prevent athletic abuse. The legalization debate surfaced periodically before being dismissed by mainstream medical and athletic authorities. Harm reduction advocates argued that prohibition wasn't preventing clenbuterol use, but was making it more dangerous. If the drug were available through legitimate medical channels with proper supervision, users could obtain pharmaceutical-grade products with accurate dosing instead of mystery pills from Chinese laboratories. Doctors could monitor cardiac function and electrolyte levels, intervening before complications became life-threatening. The argument had merit but faced insurmountable political opposition. Sports organizations couldn't endorse legalization without abandoning the competitive fairness principles justifying their existence. Public health authorities refused to sanction non-medical drug use regardless of harm reduction benefits. Portugal's drug decriminalization model offered a potential template. The country had decriminalized personal possession of all drugs in 2001, treating use as a public health issue rather than criminal matter. Overdose deaths decreased, HIV infection rates dropped, and problematic drug use declined. But applying this model to performance-enhancing drugs raised different questions than heroin decriminalization. Athletic competition fairness concerns didn't exist for recreational drugs. Nobody cared if both runners in a race were using heroin, but one using clenbuterol while the other remained natural fundamentally altered the competition's meaning. The fairness issue couldn't be resolved through decriminalization alone. Some researchers proposed creating separate enhanced athletic categories. Let natural athletes compete against each other with rigorous testing. Let enhanced athletes compete in separate divisions with minimal restrictions and medical monitoring. The transparency would eliminate the current farce where everyone pretended elite athletics was clean despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. Critics argued this would pressure athletes into enhancement by making the pharmaceutical division more prestigious and lucrative. Athletes would face a choice: remain natural and compete for smaller prizes and less recognition, or accept health risks to compete at the highest enhanced levels. The proposal never progressed beyond academic discussion, because sports organizations refused to acknowledge that current anti-doping approaches had failed comprehensively. Harm reduction programs existed in some European countries where needle exchanges and drug testing services operated for performance-enhancing drug users. Organizations like Wadeno's in the UK offered free testing of substances so users could verify they'd actually purchased what they thought they'd ordered. The testing revealed alarming contamination rates. Clenbuterol tablets containing no actual clenbuterol, products adulterated with more dangerous stimulants, dosing varying wildly from labelled amounts. These programs operated in legal grey zones, providing services that probably prevented deaths, but that officially condoned illegal drug use. Medical professionals involved argued they were meeting users where they were, rather than where prohibition said they should be. testing technology continued evolving in the endless arms race between detection and evasion. Hair sample analysis could establish long-term use patterns extending months into the past, far beyond the detection windows of blood and urine testing. But hair testing required physical samples that athletes could refuse in jurisdictions protecting bodily autonomy. Biological passport programs tracked physiological markers over time, identifying impossible changes even when specific drugs couldn't be detected. Artificial intelligence algorithms analyzed athlete performance data, looking for statistical anomalies suggesting enhancement. Every technological advance created new evasion strategies. Athletes used masking agents, timed drug cycles to avoid detection windows, or microdose to stay below testing thresholds. The athlete biological passport showed the most promise for future anti-doping efforts. Instead of detecting specific substances, the program monitored individual physiological values like hematocrit, hemoglobin, and hormonal markers over extended periods. Dramatic changes that couldn't be explained by training adaptations triggered investigations. The system worked by establishing what was normal for each athlete individually, then identifying departures from those norms. Sophisticated users could beat it by maintaining values within their established ranges, but doing so required restraint that many athletes lacked. The passport program caught some cheaters who would have evaded traditional testing, though it couldn't eliminate pharmaceutical use by disciplined athletes who understood the system's limitations. Gene doping represented the next frontier that might make current enhancement debates obsolete. Scientists had demonstrated the ability to modify genes controlling muscle growth, oxygen transport, and metabolism in laboratory animals. Translating these techniques to humans would create performance enhancements undetectable by current testing methodologies because the changes would be genetically encoded rather than introduced through external substances. Anti-doping agencies worried about this possibility, but gene editing remained expensive and experimental in 2026. Within a decade or two, it might become the enhancement method of choice for athletes willing to accept unknown long-term risks for competitive advantages that no test could prove. The contaminated meat problem remained unsolved and probably unsolvable. Agricultural use of Clenbuterol continued in countries where enforcement was weak or non-existent. International meat trade meant contaminated products crossed borders regularly, ending up in restaurants and grocery stores worldwide. Athletes couldn't completely avoid the risk without becoming vegetarian, and even that wasn't foolproof given cross-contamination in food preparation facilities. Sports federations maintained strict liability rules while acknowledging that some positive tests resulted from legitimate contamination. The system satisfied nobody. Caught athletes with valid contamination claims lost titles and reputations, while deliberate users hid behind convenient excuses that couldn't be definitively disproven. Future food safety regulations might require pharmaceutical residue testing similar to bacterial contamination screening. The technology existed to test meat samples for Clenbuterol and other growth promoters, but implementing comprehensive testing would increase costs that would be passed to consumers. Agricultural industries opposed regulations that might expose widespread non-compliance with existing bans. The political will to address the problem didn't exist because contaminated meat wasn't causing public health crises severe enough to force action. Occasional poisoning incidents made headlines briefly before fading from attention. Athletes represented a tiny fraction of meat consumers, and their positive drug tests didn't generate sufficient outrage to drive regulatory changes. The fundamental question underlying everything was whether humanity would accept pharmaceutical enhancement or continue fighting futile battles against its spread. Technology was making enhancement easier, safer, and more accessible with every passing year. Prohibition hadn't prevented Clenbuterol distribution. Testing hadn't eliminated its use in athletics. Regulations hadn't protected public health. Yet authorities kept applying the same failed approaches while expecting different outcomes. The definition of insanity supposedly involved repeating identical actions while hoping for change results. An anti-doping policy fit that description perfectly. Some argued that enhancement was inevitable and possibly desirable. Human civilization had always used technology to exceed natural limitations. Eyeglasses enhanced vision, vaccines enhanced immune function, medicine extended lifespans far beyond what nature allowed. Why should physical performance be treated differently than these other domains where technological enhancement was not just accepted but celebrated? The counter-argument centered on fairness and coercion. Nobody was forced to wear glasses, but athletes faced enormous pressure to enhance if competitors were doing so. The difference between voluntary individual enhancement and coercive competitive dynamics created ethical complexities that eyeglasses didn't raise. The philosophical question was whether natural athletic competition had ever truly existed. Athletes in ancient Greece supposedly competed without enhancement, though historical evidence suggested they used various substances believed to improve performance. Victorian strongmen used cocaine and strychnine. Cyclists in early Tour de France races drank alcohol and used amphetamines openly. The idealized natural competition was largely mythological, a nostalgic fiction about a past that never existed. But the mythology served important cultural functions, creating narratives about human achievement and dedication that pharmaceutical reality would undermine. People wanted to believe that Olympic gold medals resulted from talent and hard work, rather than superior pharmacological programs. Clenbuterol's story wasn't really about one drug. It was about humanity's desire to exceed limitations combined with refusal to accept consequences. The drug started as legitimate medical progress, a genuine improvement in treating respiratory conditions. It became performance enhancement because humans always find ways to repurpose anything that might provide advantages. The transformation from medicine to doping wasn't unique to clenbuterol, but represented a pattern repeated across dozens of pharmaceutical classes. Any drug that affects human physiology in beneficial ways will eventually be tested for performance enhancement, regardless of medical intentions or regulatory barriers. The moral and legal limbo would continue indefinitely. Clenbuterol would remain technically illegal for athletic use, while being practically accessible to anyone determined to obtain it. Testing would catch some users while missing others more sophisticated or luckier. Athletes would die occasionally from complications, generating brief conversations about dangers that wouldn't prevent the next generation from taking identical risks. Regulatory authorities would conduct raids and celebrate enforcement successes that made no measurable impact on overall availability. The cycle was self-sustaining and showed no signs of resolution. As long as humans compete and compare, chemicals promising shortcuts will find users. The laws don't matter. The health risks don't matter. The deaths don't matter enough to overcome the desire for physical perfection and competitive advantage. Clenbuterol survived as a cautionary tale that nobody heeded, a warning that everyone ignored, a problem that society had learned to live with rather than solve. The drug that opened airways for asthma patients had opened something far more troubling, a window into humanity's willingness to sacrifice health for aesthetics, longevity for immediate results, and honesty for competitive edge. That window would never close, because the view was too tempting and the consequences were always someone else's problem, until they suddenly became your own.